Welcome to AmCham Abu Dhabi. My name is Liz Beneski. I'm the Executive Director, and I'm very, very pleased to be introducing the Legal Affairs Committee in a collaboration with the Uae Space Agency, DIFC Courts, Al-Tamimi and Company, and Raytheon Emirates for presenting this fantastic webinar, The Legal Landscape of Space. Just a few quick housekeeping rules, which you're all used to. Please remain on mute if you are not speaking, and do hold your questions for the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. I'll be monitoring any questions you have through the chat area if you'd like to put it there, and we will be happy to answer all questions at the conclusion of the presentation. And as a reminder, your participation is consent for this to be recorded for those who would like to watch it post-event. So without further ado, my thanks to everyone today ahead of time. And here is your organizer from the Legal Affairs Committee, Ms. Courtney Sater, General Counsel of Raytheon Emirates. Ms. Sater, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you to everybody for joining this event today. My name is Courtney Sater. I'm the General Counsel for Raytheon Emirates, as well as Raytheon Saudi Arabia. I'm excited to be moderating today's event, which is being hosted, as Liz said, by the AmCham Legal Affairs Committee. It's my honor to introduce the speakers for today's event. We have an esteemed group of speakers from both private and public sectors, with representatives from the law firm of Al-Tamimi, the Dubai International Financial Center Courts, and the Uae Space Agency. Today's event will start by examining the Uae national space law, as well as the interplay with international law. We will then take a deeper dive into the space agency and explore what they do and what the focus is of their policy office. The final portion of the event will focus on disputes and the groundbreaking space court of the Dubai International Financial Center Courts. Liz mentioned, please hold your questions and we'll answer them at the end, but feel free to feed them into the chat section as they arise, and Liz will collect those and then present them at the end of the presentation. So speaking first on the legal aspects of space law, focusing on the UAE and its national law, as well as the intersect with international laws and treaties, is Andrew Fawcett of Al-Tamimi. Andrew is senior counsel at Al-Tamimi. He has over 20 years of specialized digital and data experience in sophisticated legal and regulatory environments. He is a telecoms expert and has become one of the leading specialists in the Middle East on cloud-based technology deals, including government procurement and information security requirements in regards to cloud services. Andrew has advised major clients on a variety of complex contractual issues and commercial transactions, especially in connection with the launch of new platforms and services. He has assisted government departments and government-owned entities in diversification projects that invest in technological developments and improve innovation. He also provides important UAE local law advisory services to multinationals. And with that, Andrew, over to you.
Hi, good morning. Probably a little bit more about me other than that is that I'm a child of the space race, so dating myself, but I grew up at a time, you know, a bit young for the moon landing, but at a time where you got up and watched splashdowns live on television and launches of space shuttles and things like that. And the basically growing up, right, my expectation was in 2021, I'd be living on Moonbase Alpha, wearing a unitard in a car that was based on my profession, which hopefully for law would be blue or something like that. And so that's, but basically there was a point where space didn't go away. It just kind of fell off the headlines. And it's kind of very sort of a whole part of the thing of being involved in this and here in the UAE is it's invigorating again to be talking at a time where space is relevant again. So the but also with this topic, it's also quite important that the actual discussion is about the legal landscape of space. And that's because in a lot of ways, we're looking at putting terrestrial concepts around the extraterrestrial. So basically, when we talk about the concept of space law, we're really talking about a form of international law that sort of comprises of treaties and international agreements and things like that. In the field of space, there's 5 main international treaties, which I've listed there, and they deal with sort of the concepts of sort of the non-appropriation of outer space by one country, arms control, freedom of exploration, liability for damage caused by space objects, rescue of spacecraft and astronauts, and the notification and registration of space objects. And now the reason for the asterisk there is the UAE has ratified all those international treaties. Now the other thing with the general things with these treaties is basically they are basically all directed at the concept that the notion of outer space and activities are basically for the benefit and of all nations, and that's the general thrust of these laws. Another area that I should mention just before moving off those treaties is that another main aspect is in relation to satellites, because basically satellites and communication with satellites requires the use of radio spectrum. And there's another organization, the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, which is sort of an adjunct of the UN, which is responsible for the global coordination of radio frequency spectrum. And basically, they also have a role in terms of satellites regulating how and avoiding harmful interference. So in terms of satellites, there is a role of having to have registration through the ITU. So importantly, one of those treaties, the Outer Space Treaty, basically puts responsibilities for regulating space activities, including both government and the private sector, on the individual countries where the activity is taking place. Now, at the moment, we're seeing globally a sort of a refresh of a lot of national laws, and the UAE's approach is consistent with that. And we're also seeing, as you're probably aware from the news, of the likes of the activities of Virgin and Richard Branson and the Amazon activities, that we're seeing the advent of commercial activities like space tourism, space mining, and a lot of the thing with these laws is looking at how to regulate these commercial activities in a manner that doesn't prevent or preclude investment, but is also consistent with the international laws and these concepts of basically for all mankind. So in terms of the UAE, I'll look at but basically there's sort of 3 main approaches. To go more quickly over them, maybe Fatima may pick up some of these. There's sort of 3 things, which is our national space policy, which came in from in 2016. Next slide, please. And then there's the National Space Strategy, which takes the policy forward, and then, which we'll dive into a little bit deeper now, the federal law number 12 of 2019, which is the UAE's space law. And this is, as I was sort of explaining at the outset, space law is a lot of international law treaties, but for the nature of laws, it is that it's for the jurisdictions to make laws ratifying and regulating those within their jurisdiction. And this is basically how the UAE is doing that. As you can see from those objectives, they're consistent with the treaties and what I was talking about, stimulating the investment and encouraging private sector participation, but also supporting those commitments to the international conventions and treaties. And that's an interesting balance. Next slide, please. So firstly, I haven't got it detailed there, but what is space? There are definitions in the law which talked about the specified area basically being the area of above 80 kilometres from the average sea level. So essentially everything further than that is we're in the specified area where space activities take place. They also define outer space as being the area above the Earth's atmosphere. So this law applies to those space activities and space sector related activities. But again, understanding the concept that it's basically by things done by the state or things from the state is the application of the law. And this is consistent with the approach of the international treaties. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of a list. And so basically the law regulates space activities and it's pretty comprehensive. In terms of the audience, part of the things to note, probably the ones more towards the bottom, the fact of the exploration, exploitation of space resources and on both a scientific and commercial basis, and the manufacture assembly completion of space technologies. Space technologies itself isn't defined by the law. And then under these other activities, there's things like collecting meteorites that fall within the jurisdiction. Next slide, please. Now, so here I've basically just sort of flagged that those type of issues aren't coming under the law and are more of a commercial focus. Clearly and importantly, the law establishes the space agency, but we have Fatima here to talk about the agency. So this is the one area in terms of regulating essentially commercial activities is basically, it's basically prohibited to undertake space activities or space sector related activities without obtaining a permit from the space agency. And so those activities are owning a space object, carrying out the space activities and establishing or possessing facilities or utilities. And then on top of that, there's other permits or approvals needed for carrying manned space flight activities. A lot of that's directed at making sure the astronauts understand what they're doing. Use of nuclear energy sources and these kind of things. And going back to that regulation I talked about with the ITU, in terms of satellite communications, what the agency does there is issue a non-objection, but in that scenario, the permit comes from the TDRA as the regulator of telecommunications here in the UAE. And a lot of these things are, in terms of the law, as it's most of the laws in the jurisdiction is the law sets out the requirements at a high level, and a lot of that has to be supported by regulations, and some of those have been issued, but a lot of them are still under progress as to how these things get regulated. But so part of it is watch the space still. Sorry for the pun. Then finally for me, which links into DIFC courts presentation. Next slide is on sorry, I skipped a part. The other thing is part of the regulation is in terms of all these permits that there's also requirements on operators to immediately notify the agency of certain things should they occur, basically incidents or accidents, and also cooperate with any investigations by the agency. One of the huge things, we hear about this sort of plastic island floating in our oceans. There's a heck of a lot of space debris up there now. And the law puts in place things for requiring steps to mitigate that space debris and what to do with that as well. And next slide. Okay, so again, dealing with what you're permitted to do and things like that, the law also sets out parameters regarding the liability for activities in space, and generally it breaks this out between the liability between contracting parties. Now the law it doesn't exclude liability for activities that have an effect on Earth or to other people in space, even if you're going in terms of the permits issued by the government or the agency. But there are some restrictions between parties that have contracted between each other and the limits of liability there. There's also parts of the law that are directed at the damage caused to property of the state and others, and other countries and international activities, and damage caused to other objects. So in terms of the terrestrial disputes and things that we're looking at, the law here sets out the parameters for who's liable, exempting the agency in certain in most situations and what their role is, and also indicating it's essentially indemnifying the state for activities that have an effect in other jurisdictions. I think in terms of the time allotted, that's probably for me, and it's to hand over to Fatima and Anna now.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for providing us the details on the legal landscape in this area of law. We'll now move over to the UAE Space Agency and hear about their initiatives, particularly with respect to their policies and regulations. So joining us today from the UAE Space Agency is Ms. Fatma Al-Shamsi. At the UAE Space Agency, Ms. Fatma is the acting head of the Space Regulations and Policy section. In her role, she supports the development and governance of the UAE National Space Strategy 2030 and the development of reports related to space economy and sustainability. In addition, Ms. Fatma represents the space sector as a member of the National Experts Program. Prior to her role in the agency, she worked as a strategist and an engineer in Abu Dhabi Digital Authority, Khalifa University, and the Agency for Science, Technology, and Research in Singapore. Thank you, Ms. Fatma, for joining us today. I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Courtney and Andrew. I can have my slides. So it was very, I'm really happy to listen to Andrew explaining our law. It was very informative and smooth. So from my perspective, I would like, can we go to the next slide? So the focus today is that I would like to give you a more holistic overview where the law came from, the idea of having a national law in the UAE, how does it tie with a policy perspective and the overall space economy. Let us start with the international law. If I go to the next slide. So as you know, having a national law comes from the international obligations that as a UAE government need to abide with. So generally, the scope of space law comes from the principles and standards from international law, the international agreements and treaties, any national laws and rules and regulations related to the space sector. And this is generally to complement the role of space. So the space today has a huge contribution to environmental monitoring, natural resources management, urban planning, and in different areas. So in order for us to make the space sector in the UAE attractive and convenient, we need to have the laws and regulations set by the government and the operations clear for everyone. If we can go to the next slide, please. So as Andrew explained, there are 5 international treaties mainly concerned and related to space. The UAE is a signatory of 4 out of 5. So the Outer Space Treaty, the Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, and the Registration Convention. I won't go into details as Andrew covered it as much as needed. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so what are the general states obligations when it comes to international space law? So for this is a simple list. So there's a responsibility on the national activities. So the UAE is responsible for that. There's a responsibility in terms of authorization of the national activities, the rescue of astronauts. So as the UAE has the astronaut program, we became a signatory of the rescue agreement, as well as it's an obligation on us. The responsibility to register the space objects. So as we have objects being launched into outer space, we need to have a national registry, as well as register our space objects in the International Registry of the United Nations. When it comes to the responsibility, there is a responsibility on the damage caused by the space objects. Of course, the weaponization. Now, this is a huge topic that's being discussed at an international level. And of course, the dispute and resolved by diplomatic means, meaning the participation in international committees such as COPOS, where member states come and they discuss all of the topics related to space, whether it's from a legal perspective or from a technical perspective. Can we go next? Okay, so let me give you an overview of the Space Agency. So it was established in 2014, and the mandates mainly focus on 5 areas. The main mandate is regulating, having a regulatory framework, so regulating the space sector, developing the expertise in the domain, having a space exploration program, enriching the sector with research and development projects, and of course, international cooperation. As you all know, space is dependent on successful international cooperation with the member states. If we go next. So when it comes to the national regulatory framework, where does it come from? So there's the international policies, the international law, the future directions, and the space activities in general. Then comes the leadership direction. And all of that derived having first our national space policy. The national space policy gave us the hopes or the ambitious, what are we going to achieve in the space sector? So it was launched in 2016 and gave the general lines of where us as a UAE Space Agency or as a UAE government would like to go in, with the space program in general. And then we went into details. In terms of initiatives, we defined the National Space Strategy 2030. It's a sectorial strategy, a 10-year plan. It started from 2020 until 2030. So there are 71 initiatives, And among them, of course, there are initiatives related to the regulating of the space sector, and I'll walk you through them very soon. Now, this is from a policy perspective. The other angle is, as you know, once a country becomes a member of international treaty, and of course, as UAE, because of our obligations to the international community when it comes to carrying space activities, there was a need to have a space law. So the space law was launched in 2019, and of course, the regulations that have the details of how are we going to implement the items included within the law. Next. Okay, so when it comes to the space policy, you will see that there are elements within the principles, goals, key enablers, guidelines, and the governments that are related to governing the space sector. When it comes to the principles, it is very important that we respect international laws and treaties, and we support the growth and diversification of the economy. So supporting the economy comes from having a proper regulatory framework. When it comes to the goals, we should, the UAE is keen to develop sustainable competitiveness and innovative commercial space industry. And of course, this can be achieved by promoting safe and stable space environment. And what are the enablers that will enable us achieve that goal is the continuous awareness of the importance of space and its activities, and having an effective and attractive space regulatory framework, and of course, having a national and regional and global cooperation and partnerships in this area. Can we go next? Now, this is in terms of the national space policy. As you can see, there was elements that are very high in terms. Now, when the space strategy came, we defined 6 strategic objectives, as you can see. The 6th strategic objective, the one number 6, is focusing on enabling a regulatory framework that is attractive, that is a non-restrictive. Here I have a number of initiatives that are related to that strategic objective. One is for the UAE to develop the regulatory framework and to monitor compliance. Second is to develop an authorization system for space activities. And third, to establish a mechanism to ensure effective participation at international level through paperwork and reports on the state's efforts. So this is an example of the initiatives that we have within the National Space Strategy. Can we go next, please? Now, when it comes to the federal law, this is a general highlight of the law. It was launched in 2019. It includes 9 chapters, 54 articles, and it lays down the foundations and general rules relating to authorization of space activities, the related activities, the registration of space objects, the insurance and guarantees, audit and penalties. Now, what is the objective of the law? As explained by Andrew, the main objective of our law is to support the diversification of the economy. We want to have our space economy grow. So this is the main objective of our law. So for the one is to promote and enable participation in private and academic sectors. And second, because of our obligations, support safety and security of environmental protection and promote transparency and conformity with international conventions. Can we go next, please? Okay. So the scope of applications, any space activities conducted from the UAE, vessels or airplanes registered in the state on any space objects mainly, and entities that have the nationality of the UAE. Next. Can you go next? Okay, so when it comes to regulated activities, there are 14 regulated activities. You will see that we, as Andrew also explained, that it's quite comprehensive. There are a large number of activities included in our space law. The idea of including all of these, I understand that not all of these activities are present in the UAE at the moment, but because we want to have this law comprehensive and to include all of the space activities that may not be operating or present at the current moment, but could be present in the future because of our ambitious program in the space domain. It was the idea to include them in our space law. So the space law does not include only activities that are mainly related to space, but also the activities that are related to the space sector, from trading of meteoroid stones and other activities. Can we go next, please? Now, having the space law, what are the impacts? This is a very important aspect that we need to consider. One is that, as you know, space is one of the, I wouldn't say the least regulated industries in the world, but it is one of the most important industries because it touches not just the boundaries of the country, but it reaches space. So it's very important to regulate the sector. Secondly is the importance of international organizations. So for us as a UAE, it's very important to show our alignment and conformity with the relevant international organizations such as the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, the General Assembly, and the other organizations. Also, countries with ambitious space-related programs are constantly developing facilities. So because the UAE, if we look at since the establishment of the Uae Space Agency, and even prior to that, because our space sector, starting from the year 1999, the UAE moved from a user of data to an operator. And having the continuous growth of the sector means that we need to have a clear guidelines for our operators to use it as a reference, as well as to regulate activities. Also, when speaking about the space debris, the increasing risk on space objects, whether it's being in space or covering both intentional risk as well as non-intentional risk. So this is a very important aspect to consider. And of course, the law gave us helped to mitigate this aspect. And last, it is important to balance the security, safety, and environmental, as well as the commercial requirements. And this is what we are trying to do here from having our space law. Can we go next? Now, in this slide, you can see a very high level value chain of the UAE space sector. As you can see, there's entities that are working towards the upstream, and there are entities that are working towards the downstream. Now, what does the value chain tells us? It means that there are a lot of entities that have huge interest in having activities related to space. You will see that there are entities that are established entities that are operators of in the space industry, focusing on it solely, but there are other entities that are from other sectors or adjacent sectors, but they have programs related to space. So the idea here is that we want to also have the value chain grow, and to have the entities grow even further, to have their activities supported. So for us, when it comes to the law, we have seen a huge number of entities. I wouldn't say huge, but increased number of entities that are approaching the Uae Space Agency to register their space objects, to register their companies. So there is an interest to enter the market in the UAE, and for us to enable them. This is a question that we continuously ask ourselves. And let me assure you that we will definitely continue to revise our documents, whether it's being the regulations, the policies, and because the main objective here is that we want to see the space sector grow from an economic perspective, and have the enablement in terms of the space policies and regulations support them and complement the growth. Can we go next, please? Now, this is one of the impact factors. We work on the economic survey, and within the economic survey, there's an indicator that we measure on a yearly basis. Here you can see that we have noticed that there's an increase of 162% from the year of 2017 until the year of 2019 in the number of service contracts provided by Uae Space Agency entities. So the space entities working within the UAE are providing services to other sectors within the UAE as well as externally. And according to the statistic, only in the year of 2019, there were 1,859 service contracts. And the number is increasing. So if we see the numbers going up, it means that we are going in the right track. If we see a number is, for example, there's a contribution towards a specific sector, we look at the sector and then we evaluate how can we support even providing the means in terms of policies and guidelines in that area. And one example of that is the policy guidelines in terms of developing, for example, the entities that have projects of remote sensing. So let's say we are giving them a guideline of how are they going to provide their service, what is the best approach in terms of international benchmarks. So this is one of the tools that we are trying to support the entities in the country. And next. So last but not least, as you all know, the benefits derived from space technology transfers is huge. Why are we working in the space domain? Mainly, we can see that the space helps creating jobs. If we are looking at it from a socio-economic perspective, it generates revenue. This is from an economic perspective. It increases the productivity and efficiency. It helps saving lives and improving lives. Today, the UAE is a member of the International Disaster Charter with our membership and with our operators. For example, with KhalifaSat, we have the imageries being taken, and we can, in the case of floods in any other countries, we support them in that aspect. So this is an impact that we want to see, not just at a local level, but also at an international level. And with that, I close my presentation. And please feel free to ask any questions by the end of the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fatima. That was really very interesting. I appreciate that. I learned a lot. So we now have an understanding of the laws that govern the space sector from Andrew, both in the UAE as well as international, as well as some background of the role of the space agency and how the UAE policies and legislation are developed in this area. So with that, I'm going to move over to the topic of disputes. And in this context, I would like to introduce Ms. Amna Al-Owais, who will be speaking about the DIFC Courts Space Court. And Ms. Amna is the Chief Registrar of the DIFC Courts, where she oversees operations and quality management, supervising the court's judicial officers and registry personnel, and the delivery of comprehensive court public services. She spearheads special projects across the DIFC courts, specifically in the field of technology and innovation, working to embrace digital transformation for core court services. In addition to her role in the DIFC courts, Ms. Amna is also the registrar of the special tribunal related to the Dubai World, chairwoman of the DIFC Courts Users Committee, chairwoman of the DIFC Courts In-House Council Committee, and a member of the Consulting Council for the University of Sharjah College of Law. In 2014, she was also appointed to the advisory board of the International Bar Association's Access to Justice and Legal Aid Committee. Ms. Owais, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Courtney, for this introduction and fellow panelists. I hope today we will be able to explain the role of the DIFC courts, whether directly or indirectly, as far as the space industry is concerned. So I'm Anil Uae. I'm the Chief Registrar of the DIFC courts. I'm celebrating very soon 15 years since working with the DIFC courts. There was never a dull moment. I'm proud to be part of this amazing institution where we always try to be a few steps ahead as far as judicial excellence is concerned. I would like to give you some sort of background on why we exist as a court within the Dubai International Financial Center and why common law. So back in 2004, when the leadership of Dubai were exploring the aspect of creating the center, there were a few questions that the leadership had in terms of what was stopping the international financial institutions and companies that actually would like to come and set up in Dubai. I'm told my voice is not so clear, so I might just move to my headset. 1 second.
So everyone can hear me better now?
That's much better.
Okay,
Thank you.
excellent. I was telling Courtney, I'm trying to be fancy with the AirPods, but anyways, I'll be practical. So in terms of, the question that was posed to the international community, what was stopping you from coming to Dubai and generally the UAE? And one major, let's say, remark or concern was the unfamiliarity with the legal system, in addition to the English language. And at that point, the major financial hubs worldwide come from New York, London, Singapore, and many other countries. So the thought was then to create a fully accessible center that has all of the functions and tools to enable those companies to come and thrive and grow with the economy within Dubai and the UAE. And it was decided at that time to have a court system that operates within the English language and common law. And you might wonder why common law? And common law normally is there to provide the certainty that businesses need, as common law systems operate within a precedent system, unlike civil law court systems where they operate in a different nature rather than the common law where certainty is there for business users. And we're a business court, and that is quite important that we provide the certainty that companies need. Within the DIFC courts, our jurisdiction spans from taking care of cases that have a link to the DIFC, or one party is registered within the DIFC, the subject matter of the dispute occurred within the DIFC, and that is our default jurisdiction. However, back in 2011, due to the demand of the community and the legal economy, or let's say legal community, it was decided to open the jurisdiction to allow for opt-in jurisdiction, which means any two parties, wherever they're from, international parties, local, and so forth, if they choose us within their contracts as within their dispute resolution clause, they can choose the DIFC courts as a forum to handle the litigation. We always say that we're, like a doctor, we want you to know that we're available. However, as we are a commercial and business court, we want you to resolve your disputes out of the courts, and we encourage settlement, and that's one of our overriding objectives, because in that way we can actually save relationships. And being part of the UAE and as an opt-in jurisdiction, we're really keen on making sure business is there to grow and expand rather than fall apart. And within the DIFC courts, the way how we operate, our judicial excellence, our procedures is all orchestrated in a way that we encourage settlement. So there are many cases that if they end up before the DIFC courts, most of them actually end up having settlements before going to trial, and that is how we built our procedures, our fee structure, and so forth. Within the DIFC courts, we have 4 main pillars, and this is how we operate as a court and how we set our goals, our objectives. Judicial excellence, we believe we have more than 400 years of experience across our international bench of judges. Service excellence, We operate to an extent that we are courts as a service rather than a court as a place, because that's quite important to us, since always you have a winning and losing party, but the journey through the courts is important that you have a 5-star service. Third, we have the innovation aspect and connectivity. I'm going to speak about connectivity towards the end because it's important and many people ask about enforcement, but the focus now will be more on innovation. Back in 2016, we created the Courts of the Future initiative. And the Courts of the Future initiative has multiple, let's say, projects, special projects, out of which our discussion today, the Courts of Space. In 2021, we created the Courts of Space initiative. We worked with many people, including the Space Agency, Dubai Future Foundation. Dubai Future Foundation is our main partner in this initiative. And we have now, as of February 2021, once the project has been kicked off, we have, as of April 2021, the working group that encompasses leaders from the space industry, whether from the commercial side of things or through different local and regional agencies. And you might ask, why did the DIFC courts think of this industry? As a court, we handle all commercial and civil disputes, whether space or not. However, we want to play a role as a court in supporting the ecosystem as far as the space industry is concerned. We've heard from Fatma, there are strategic objectives and goals. There are many aspects that actually are shaping the socio-economic economical impact, especially for the UAE. And we believe, having such a court that thinks a few steps ahead in terms of what we can do to provide greater certainty, this is our role really, and that's why we created the Courts of Space initiative. As we believe, and we've seen research that across the world, when you have a successful economic system or economy, you actually have a successful court system. And successful court systems mean less and less cases, and that's our overriding objective. So part of the Courts of Space initiative is to create that think tank of bringing the thought leaders from worldwide to discuss and understand where we are at the moment as far as the landscape is concerned. And of course, part of the UAE as a court, we are quite keen on understanding how we can play a role. Part of the outputs of the Courts of Space currently, we're working on a space disputes guide, and this space disputes guide will come, inshallah, in many editions, many future parts. But the first part will focus, if a case ends up being before the DIFC court that is relating to the space industry, it shows the step-by-step guide of how the court case will actually evolve within the courts, from the time of filing the case until judgment, of course, without having to go through judgments and scenarios of judgment, because at the end of the day, we do not want to impact, the precedents yet, and this is not really official precedents. So the thought process is how we can show the space industry stakeholders, the industry players, that the DIFC course is able and committed to improve the services available for dispute resolution as far as the space industry is concerned. From my understanding, from the different people that we've come across, mainly when it comes to space disputes, it always goes to arbitration, and of course it's understandable to its confidentiality nature, the privacy it can offer, and that has been always the case. In addition, another reason would be for stakeholders not using court systems is that courts have not really focused in the past on such an industry, and we believe now we are trying to set a new precedent of having the court system as a new way of resolving disputes. And we are hoping in the future to create the best forum, even if it had to be creating a special division within the DIFC courts. As I mentioned, we're a commercial court. As it is, without having a special division, we can handle any dispute, including space disputes. However, in order to cater for specific requirements, we're more than happy to explore how we can create a special division that has special rules. So as of today, we have 2 special divisions within the DIFC courts, apart from the general commercial cases. We have the arbitration division, which handles arbitration related cases. And we have the technology and construction division, which handles technology related disputes and construction. And all these, these divisions have their special rules within the court procedures. And that is basically the attractiveness of choosing the DIFC course if you want to have special rules for special cases. And now we're embarking this journey for the courts of space, and we need, the support of the industry players and also input to see what is required from the court's perspective in order to be an opt-in jurisdiction, a forum of choice, which is neutral, especially when it comes to handling international disputes. With that, I will now turn to enforcement, which I believe it's a very important aspect. As we know, if you can't turn, judgment into money, then the whole proceedings were useless in a way. And we believe part of our connectivity, the 4th pillar of the DIFC courts, that connectivity is vital when it comes to access to justice. We believe we're one of the most connected courts in the world when it comes to enforcement for 3 reasons. First is as we're a court part of the UAE, so we get the value of all of the UAE treaties that the country has entered into as far as the enforcement is concerned. So that is one angle. The second is, as a common law court, reciprocal arrangements are available for all common law courts. So all our common law, sister courts would honor our judgments because we are a common law court. Third reason is that part of our initiative to expand relationships, to create awareness with other judiciaries worldwide, especially the top trading partners of the UAE and general, advanced common law jurisdictions, we've started creating alliances and relationships through memoranda of guidance, where we have international memoranda signed with such jurisdictions. Very simple, just to show what happens in terms of enforcement. So let's say we have a case, a judgment that needs to be enforced in, let's say, Australia. What are the steps that are required from the legal community, the lawyer, the company, to enforce their judgment, let's say, in Sydney, and vice versa? If there was a judgment creditor in Sydney that wants to enforce their judgment in the DIFC court, what are the requirements and steps as far as the procedures are concerned? So we've done quite a lot in terms of enforcement, practices, because we know enforcement is quite an important aspect when it comes to choosing an opt-in jurisdiction, when deciding whether you need to go to this courts. And normally, of course, lawyers have their own tactics in deciding which forum is the best for them. And I would say what we've seen in terms of Riyadh Convention, GCC, as a common law court, we have a lot of, let's say, add-ons and benefits as far as enforcement is concerned. And with that, I'm looking forward to, having an open discussion with our audience today. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Amna. That was fantastic. It's really so interesting to hear all of these presentations. So now we will turn it over to some questions and answers. Liz, I think you've been collecting some questions from the chat column.
I have. We've got quite, I also want to compliment what an outstanding presentation from all 3 panelists. And I've got notes upon notes upon notes. But the first question comes from Mohammed Amara, and this question is for Andrew. He asks, could you tell us what is the basis of the state or operator's liability for damages caused to third party in the UAE national space law? And how is that different from liability general principles in the UAE civil law? Unmute, Andrew.
Hi, Mohammed, thank you for that one. Basically, in terms of the law, is that in terms of, sorry, Liz, the question is for in relation to which
State
aspects of liability?
operators' liability for damages caused to third parties inside the UAE International Space Law. How is this different from the liability general principles in the UAE civil law?
Right. Well, I mean, firstly, the in terms of the law, recognizing the role and of the for other parties, the law sets out liability for particularly for hitting other space objects, and that puts into a situation, it requires an error to be proven, but then in that situation, the operator is liable for any damage caused that he owns to the other person, and in terms of that. In terms of the aspects of the other federal laws under that, Mohammed, I'm not so clear in where that would come to in terms of the wider responsibility. Turning to the other aspect of liability where it's for contracting parties. Again, the law specifically recognises and limits the liability between contracting parties and the participants there. And in that situation, it appears to me to be more, the law recognises it would be particularly governed by the contract between the parties. And then it comes down to the choice of law and governing law aspects of it. But that's a slightly fudged answer in terms of I haven't quite looked at that perspective from the law clearly sets out liability arrangements in terms of the relationship and the roles in space. How that will actually be looked at in terms of a court situation, if proceedings are in the UAE, need to have a look at that further.
Thank you, Andrew. Our next question is from Mr. Laubach, who happens to be chairman of this committee. And this question is for Ms. Amna. Amna, Charles would like to know, is the UAE going to require dispute resolution by the UAE Space Court in contracts involving the UAE's space missions? And will the jurisdiction of the UAE Space Court be available for opt-in by parties who are outside the UAE?
Thank you for this question. It's quite important for our audience to understand our jurisdiction. So the courts, generally speaking, are open to everyone that have a commercial and civil contract. So at the time of drafting the contract or after the contract has been created, you have the opportunity to amend your dispute resolution clause. If you wish to choose the DIFC courts, for example, you can do it at the time of drafting or after the contract has been created. And the third scenario, which is quite tough, is after the dispute. Rarely speaking, parties would try to agree on anything after dispute has arisen. But if they do, then, hats off to them. So in terms of the UAE space industry or sector agency, UAE space missions, this is a matter for, the parties, including the UAE government, to decide whether they want to use the DIFC courts. The court is open to everyone, and it's a neutral jurisdiction. It's not imposed on anyone. So I believe maybe your question is more whether, the leadership or the government has imposed the parties to choose the DIFC courts only because it's availability or it's, jurisdiction within the UAE. So for us, we're quite open. It all depends on consensus of the parties. So no matter who they are, if they decide to choose the DIFC courts because they believe it's the best forum for them, then they're more than welcome to choose the DIFC court. So yes, we are open to everyone worldwide, whether space related or not, as long as they have a contract and they've chosen us within their dispute resolution in writing.
Impressive, thank you. We have a question for Ms. Fatima, of course. The question, Ms. Fatima, is what can be done by the government or the private sector to further the value chain by promoting engagement with educational institutions both here in the UAE and outside the UAE?
Thank you, Les, for the question. So in regarding of promoting education, we currently have programs related to building capabilities with our universities locally. We also provide internships with our international partners as well as local partners. For one of the international partners is the International Space Station. The attendees are mostly from university students as well as employees that are working within the space sector. We also have winter camps, summer camps. So these are all efforts to develop capabilities in the sector, long aside having partnerships in regarding to providing scholarships for students. We currently have students that are working within the UAE as well as in international universities in the areas related to space.
Wow, thank you. Now, hold on, another question for you, Ms. Fatima. Are there any of the space activities which require permits or approvals reserved specifically for the public sector, like owning a space object?
Okay, when it comes to space activities, if there's a new establishment, they need to approach the Uae Space Agency to give them the no objection certificate, and then they proceed with the economic ministry. If it includes an activity related to telecommunication, the next stage after the Uae Space Agency will be the TDRA for the approvals. In other terms, when it comes to owning an object, for example, the owning of meteoroids, we first ask the request personnel to validate if this is an actual meteoroid or not. And there are entities in the UAE that can do that service for them. And so we forward the request to the relevant entity, and then they can approach us as an agency, and we will decide upon that. Now, there's two approaches. Currently, we have a temporary solution of the ownership. If the ownership was before the launch of the law, it belongs to them. After launching the law, there are different considerations, and it's currently under review by the agency, and it will be launched pretty soon, inshallah.
Wow, thank you, Fatima.
If
Andrew,
I could just add to that,
sure,
sorry,
please.
is that, I mean, in terms of sort of reserving things, particularly for the private sector, it's more of a question of the law facilitating the private sector. The law defines an operator as being any person carrying out a space activity, and then sets out the various activities or things that require a permit. So it's not, it's more that if you are the private sector, this sets out the mechanism for getting the necessary, well, what permits you need to get and the approach for doing them.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Great.
So Andrew, we have just a couple more questions. I mean, there's a lot, but I'm trying to pick so we cover a lot of topics. Andrew, a question's come up. How do the treaties handle sovereign immunity?
Short answer, I don't know. I'd have to have a look at it. I mean, it is a concept of international law, and the whole point of the treaties and ratifying and acceding to them is that the ratifying parties undertake those obligations. And the concept of sovereign immunity is not necessarily as completely wide as I think is what it's generally perceived as well. But the whole point is it's international law. It's states agreeing to adopt certain things.
Great. Two more questions, and then this is last call for any questions. I show two more. Real quick, Ms. Fatima, can you explain more about the service agreements that the UAE Space Agency has and how those work?
Okay, in terms of the service contracts, the statistics that I showed in the graph while I'm presenting, this is where the question is coming from.
Courtney, do you have further insight on that particular question? Yes, because she is helping send questions. Yes, this is what it's.
Okay, I believe it is. Okay, so the idea is, for example, let's give an example of Khalifa Sat. Today, Khalifa Sat provides imageries at Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center, receives requests from entities, whether it's being from the private sector, from the government sector. And when providing the service, there's an agreement of providing the service. So through the annual economic assessment that the Uae Space Agency carries out with the Federal Competitiveness Center, we calculate the number of contracts that are being offered by our space entities to organization, whether it's being in the country or outside of the country, based on the sector that the service is providing it with. So this is the main idea behind the indicator that I explained in the slide.
Fantastic. Final question comes from Lionel, and he's asking, and it's to whomever would like to answer it, but it's kind of interesting because it addresses something that I hope to achieve someday, which is space flight. So, does the UAE space law speak in any detail at this time to the regulations pertaining to the safety of crew and spaceflight participants? Open question to whomever.
Okay, so if I may answer, just generally from the space law perspective, it includes the items generally feeding to the liability convention as well as the rescue agreement. However, we have a regulation that gives a more in-depth guidelines in terms of the crews that are going to participate in the space flight, in terms of the service provider that is going to provide the service. So all of these aspects are detailed in a separate regulation that will be also launched very soon, inshallah.
Wow. Well, we have some other questions, but I'm very mindful of your, ladies and gentlemen's time. So I'm going to hand this over to Ms. Sader for concluding remarks. Ms. Sader, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you again to our fantastic speakers. Very much appreciate you taking the time out and providing really such timely and fascinating perspectives. I know there were a lot of questions, so apologize if we did not get to your question, but definitely appreciate all of the participation. This is no doubt an area of the law that will continue to develop and grow. So perhaps we're in store for, a space law webinar part 2 down the line. We'll see. So thank you so much, Liz. That's all I've got.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. And again, heartfelt appreciation from all of our members and our guests here at AmCham Abu Dhabi, to Ms. Amna, Ms. Fatima, and Mr. Andrew, and of course you as well, Ms. Sader. Thanks, everyone. Go out and have a spacey kind of day. Take care, be safe. This concludes the event. Thank you.
Thank you.